Good morning, YouTube viewers and subscribers. A few weeks ago I published a video explaining how I do an initial setup of a twin needle carb, and I think that video was fairly well received. The one thing that I didn't mention in that video was that I was using a twin needle carb. I think it became very obvious to everybody that I had a twin needle carb there, but that's not the only style of carburetor there are. Many people end up buying engines that have an Air Bleed carb. And Air Bleed carbs differ in a very huge way from twin needle carbs, in that on a twin needle carb, the idle speed adjustment or low speed adjustment screw, actually you screw it in and it adjusts the flow of fuel at low speed, whereas an Air Bleed carb adjusts the amount of airflow coming into a carb at low speed. So what I've got here today is I've got two Air Bleed carbs and a traditional twin needle carb, and this particular carb is an OS something 20D. Now I just brought it here just to show you, basic differences. Not really talking about that. The other carb I've got here is an Ninya Carb that's really kind of disassembled. I didn't feel like pulling a carb off of an operational engine for this. Let me zoom in just a hair more here so we can see a bit better. Now this Ninya Carb came off of an Ninya 46 4-cycle engine, and it's a pretty typical Ninya Carb. This hole here is for the throttle barrel retaining or the throttle stop screw. This screw is the Air Bleed adjustment screw. So those of you that are unfamiliar or don't know what kind of carb you've got, the biggest or the easiest way to tell if you've got an Air Bleed type screw is you will see a hole in the carb body and a screw associated with either opening or closing the hole opening. So I'm going to just keep looking at this OS carb, which is a 2A carb. It's an FP carb of some sort. So as you can see here, this is the Air Bleed screw, this is the Air Bleed hole, and of course our high-speed needle. If you look here, the only screw you see here is the screw that actually retains the throttle arm, the control arm. So that's it. That's pretty much all you're going to see. This screw here is your throttle stop screw or your barrel retention screw. It does two things. It either retains the barrel within the carb, and it also can be adjusted to close and reduce your minimum gap. So as I said, an Air Bleed carb is very different in how it operates from a twin needle carb. The Air Bleed carb, as I said, actually controls the amount of airflow into the carb during low speed operation. So the adjustment of this is exactly the opposite of what you would do on a twin needle carb. So if you're idling, you're at idle speed and you're using an Air Bleed carb, and your idle speed just slowly creeps up, that's usually an indication that your mixture is rich. If your idle speed doesn't stay steady and then it just slowly drops down and then the engine dies, then you're lean. So how you adjust an Air Bleed screw is that if you're running rich at idle and you want to lean the mixture out, you actually unscrew the Air Bleed. Thus, you open and allow more air to come in. The more air that comes in, the leaner it makes that mixture. Conversely, if you're rich or if you're lean and you need to richen your mixture, you want to close or go clockwise with the screw to close the amount of the opening. That reduces the airflow and allows more fuel than air, thus making it a richer mixture. Now, you may say, well, how do you set up one of these Air Bleed carbs? Well, since there's an Air Bleed there, you can't do the method where you close it fully and just blow through there, because you're always going to have a little bit of leak coming out of here unless you've got this completely closed. So the starting point for an Air Bleed carb is typically, a good rule of thumb is, and you have to use a magnifier because it's pretty tough to see most times, is about cover 50% of the opening. So screw the screw in there until you can just see, half of the opening being covered with the screw. That can be kind of challenging, but it's a good starting point, and then you can go from there. Now, I have noticed on a lot of Ninya engines Inya 4-stroke engines and Inya 2-stroke engines also utilize a lot of air bleed screws, but on the Inya 4-stroke engines I've run, I've found that they tend to really like to run rich on the low end, and I've actually had a few Inya engine 4-stroke engines that the air bleed screw is almost completely closed for a good idle. So don't be alarmed if your screw hole is basically almost completely closed. That's not necessarily a sign of bad things. It just may be how the air temperature, humidity, and those types of things are affecting it. But so that's the difference between an air bleed screw, low speed adjustment, and the twin needle.